Archetypes of Wisdom, An Introduction to Philosophy, 9th edition, Douglas J. Socio. Brief Contents. Introduction. Philosophy and the Search for Wisdom. Overview of Classical Themes. Chapter 1. The Asian Sages, Lao Tzu, Confucius, and Buddha. Chapter 2. The Presocratic Sophists. Chapter 3. The Sophist, Protagoras. Chapter 4. The Wise Man, Socrates. Chapter 5. The Philosopher King, Plato. Chapter 6. The Naturalist, Aristotle. Chapter 7. The Stoics, Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. Chapter 8. The Scholar, Thomas Aquinas. Overview of Modern Themes. Chapter 9. The Rationalist, René Descartes. Chapter 10. The Skeptic, David Hume. Chapter 11. The Universalist, Immanuel Kant. Chapter 12. The Utilitarian, John Stuart Mill. Chapter 13. The Materialist, Karl Marx. Chapter 14. The Existentialist, Soren Kierkegaard. Chapter 15. The Pragmatist, William James. Chapter 16. The Anti-Philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche. Chapter. The 20th Century, Ludwig Wittgenstein and Martin Heidegger. Chapter 18. Philosophy as a Way of Life. Introduction. Philosophy and the Search for Wisdom. Gray-eyed Athena sent them a favorable breeze, a fresh wind, singing over the wine-dark sea. Homer. Learning objectives. After you complete this chapter, you should be able to define the term philosophy. Outline the 4 primary areas of philosophy. Identify 5 philosophical archetypes. Differentiate between archetypes and stereotypes. Based on your own educational experience, analyze James Q. Wilson's claim that radical relativism is rampant on college campuses. Explain why wisdom is often associated with age. Contrast practical and theoretical knowledge. Distinguish belief from knowledge. Distinguish belief from mere belief. Explain willed ignorance. Philosophy is already an important part of your life, whether you know it or not. The word philosophy comes from Greek roots meaning the love of wisdom. The earliest philosophers were considered wise men and women, or sages, because they devoted themselves to asking big questions. What is the meaning of life? Where did everything come from? What is the nature of reality? For a long time, most philosophers were wisdom-seeking amateurs. That is, philosophy was a way of living for them, not a way of making a living. The original meaning of amateur is one who is motivated by love rather than by profit. We use the term philosophy in a similar sense when we think of a person's basic philosophy as the code of values and beliefs by which someone lives. Sometimes we talk about Abby's philosophy of cooking or Mikey's philosophy of betting on the horses. In such instances, we are thinking of philosophy as involving general principles or guidelines. Technically, that's known as having a philosophy. It is not the same thing as being a philosopher. You don't have to be a philosopher to ask philosophical questions, you just have to be a naturally curious and thoughtful person. Here's a sampling of the kinds of questions philosophers study. Does God exist? What's the meaning of life? Why do innocent people suffer? Is everything a matter of opinion? Are all people really equal, and if so, in what sense? What is the best form of government? Is it better to try to make the majority happy at the expense of a few or make a few happy at the expense of many? How are minds connected to bodies? Is there one standard of right and wrong for everyone, or are moral standards relative? Is beauty in the eye of the beholder? Does might make right? Is objectivity possible? Desirable? For deeper consideration, reflect on your own education up to this point. In what ways has it hindered, and in what ways has it supported, a love of wisdom? What to expect from this book? Although the idea of studying selected highlights of nearly 3,000 years of mostly Western philosophizing may seem exhausting, this is not meant to be an exhaustive history of philosophy or survey of philosophical topics. That is, Archetypes of Wisdom is not meant to be complete, covering every significant philosopher or every significant contribution made by the philosophers it does include. Rather, it's meant to be a representative and inviting introduction to interesting and important questions of value, meaning, and knowledge and the cultural conditions that gave rise to them. If you're reading this book as part of an academic course, I recommend treating your introduction to philosophy as an opportunity to distinguish between saying philosophical sounding things and actually philosophizing. Perhaps the chief difference between just talking about philosophical ideas and actually philosophizing about them involves the degree of rigor and discipline you apply to your reflections. We can say, then, that philosophy consists of careful reasoning about certain kinds of issues. Philosophical thinking includes careful assessment of terms, evaluation of logical reasoning, willingness to make refined distinctions, and so forth. Philosophers are especially interested in the arguments, reasons, offered to support our ideas. Philosophical issues concern ultimate values, general principles, the nature of reality, knowledge, justice, happiness, truth, God, beauty, and morality. Philosophy addresses questions that other subjects do not address at all, and it addresses them in a more thorough way. That's not to say, however, that we can tell whether or not a person is a philosopher just by his or her job description. Physicists, psychologists, physicians, literary critics, artists, poets, novelists, soldiers, housewives, all sorts of folks, engage in philosophical reflection without necessarily being labeled as philosophers. The quality of philosophical reasoning should concern us most, rather than the label philosopher. Because of their nature, philosophical questions cannot be answered in the way that a mathematical or factual question can be answered with for, or, the year 1066. Certain questions must be asked and answered anew by each culture and by any person who awakens to what Plato and Aristotle called the philosophical sense of wonder. Indeed, thoughtful individuals wrestle with philosophical questions all their lives. Philosophical query: so what do you think? If you had the choice of being happy and blissfully ignorant or philosophically concerned but not always happy, which would you choose? Why? Areas of philosophy and practice. Philosophy consists of the systematic, comprehensive study of certain questions that center on meaning, interpretation, evaluation, and logical or rational consistency. The primary areas of philosophy are listed here. Metaphysics encompasses the study of what is sometimes termed ultimate reality. As such, metaphysics raises questions about reality that go beyond sense experience, beyond ordinary science. Metaphysical questions involve free will, the mind-body relationship, supernatural existence, personal immortality, and the nature of being. Some philosophers, see chapters 10, 11, 13, and 15 to 17, question the very possibility of a reality beyond human experience, while others, see chapters 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 8, and 9, base their philosophies on metaphysical notions. Epistemology, from the Greek for knowledge, is the branch of philosophy that asks questions about knowledge, its nature and origins, and whether it is even possible. Epistemological questions involve standards of evidence, truth, belief, sources of knowledge, gradations of knowledge, memory, and perception. Epistemological issues cut across all other branches of philosophy. See, in particular, chapters 1 to 6, 8 to 11, and 13 to 17. Ethics, from the Greek word ethos, encompasses the study of moral problems, practical reasoning, right and wrong, good and bad, virtues and vices, character, moral duty, and related issues involving the nature, origins, and scope of moral values. Today, it is not uncommon for ethicists to specialize in medical ethics, business ethics, environmental ethics, academic ethics, issues of ethnicity and gender, and the nature of the good life. Ethical issues include benevolence, truth-telling, relativism, and universality. See chapters 1 to 7, 10 to 13, 16, and 17. Social and political philosophy are concerned with the nature and origins of the state, government, sovereignty, the exercise of power, the effects of social institutions on individuals, ethnicity, gender, social status, and the strengths and weaknesses of different types of societies. See chapters 1, 4, 5, 7, 12, 13, 16, and 17. Other important areas of philosophy include logic, the study of the rules of correct reasoning, axiology, the study of values, aesthetics, the study of perceptions, feelings, judgments, and ideas associated with the appreciation of beauty, art, and objects in general, and ontology, the study of being and what it means to exist. Philosophers sometimes concentrate on only one of these primary areas. Today, some philosophers go so far as to reject whole areas of philosophy as unfit for study. For example, a logician might view metaphysics as overly abstract and confused. A moral philosopher might see the study of symbolic logic as belonging to mathematics, rather than philosophy. Whenever philosophers concern themselves with the meaning of life or the general search for wisdom, however, all of these primary areas are involved, even if some are not dealt with explicitly. Contemporary academic philosophers tend to specialize even within these areas, concentrating on historical periods. Certain philosophers, the philosophy of music, religion, or law, or particular philosophical issues, such as what is justice? Is objectivity possible? More than 200 areas of specialization are currently listed by the Philosophical Documentation Center, a professional organization dedicated to compiling and disseminating research data and articles about philosophy. Philosophical archetypes in the ancient world. The wise person was known as the sage, in parts of Asia, a bodhisattva, yogi, or guru, in parts of Africa, a witch doctor, among Native Americans and the nomadic tribes of Asia, a shaman. In the Bible, the prophets were people of wisdom. In many cultures, the grandmother, or grandfather, or some other elder represents the basic image of the wise person. In the West, the wise person is often depicted as a male, but not always. In cartoons, the wise man is often caricatured as an oddball or a hermit wearing a robe of some sort, maybe carrying a staff, and sporting a long white beard. Why do you suppose that is? Because even cartoonists tap into this nearly universal image, and we recognize it. This kind of basic image is sometimes referred to as an archetype. According to psychologist C.G. Jung, 1875-1961, an archetype is an image that has been shared by the whole human race from the earliest times. In its more traditional sense, an archetype represents our conception of the essence of a certain kind of person. An archetype is a fundamental, original model of some type: mother, warrior, trickster, cynic, saint, pessimist, optimist, atheist, rationalist, idealist, and so on. A philosophical archetype is a philosopher who expresses an original or influential point of view in a way that significantly affects subsequent philosophers and non-philosophers. The difference between an archetype and an ideal is that the archetype need not be good or perfect. The difference between an archetype and a stereotype is in their depth. A stereotype is a simplistic distortion of a type of person. An archetype, by contrast, is a powerful representation of a fundamental response to universal experiences. Archetypes exemplify essential ways of coping with the universal aspects of life: suffering, death, loss, society, wealth, knowledge, love, purpose, in uncommonly pure ways. There are archetypes of evil as well as good, and of fools as well as of wise people. This introduction to philosophy is organized around philosophical archetypes. Even people who have not studied philosophy recognize the basic qualities of many philosophical archetypes. Most likely you have already encountered individuals who resemble some of them. Two brief examples will show you what I mean. One philosophical archetype is the skeptic, chapter 10. Skeptics believe that any claim to knowledge must be personally verified by their own sensory experience. They want to see, touch, taste, or measure everything. The New Testament contains an excellent example of this archetype in the person of doubting Thomas, the disciple who would not believe that Jesus had risen from the grave until he carefully examined Jesus' wounds for himself. Another philosophical archetype is the utilitarian, chapter 12. Utilitarians believe that pain is inherently bad, that pleasure is inherently good, and that all creatures strive to be as happy as possible. Thus, utilitarians argue that our private and communal behavior should always maximize pleasure and minimize pain. You might recognize their famous formula: always act to produce the greatest possible happiness for the greatest number of people. You probably also recognize utilitarian thinking in all sorts of majority rules reasoning. The philosophers we will study include these two archetypes as well as exemplars of other significant philosophical schools and orientations. Philosophical archetypes are often the founders of the schools they represent, but not always. Sometimes the archetypal representatives of a philosophy are individuals who refine and develop others' ideas. In addition to their significance in the history of philosophy, archetypes confront universally important philosophical questions in ways that continue to be interesting and engaging. Two special virtues of archetypal figures are the intensity and purity of their belief in their philosophies. Philosophical archetypes are strict advocates of a philosophical worldview or philosophical method. The intensity with which they hold to their views, combined with exceptional philosophical depth and rigor, almost always challenges our own, often unclarified, beliefs, whether we want to be challenged or not. Never fear. You alone always remain responsible for what you choose to believe, reject, or modify. Learning about philosophical archetypes is a good way to get an initial picture of a philosophical orientation and the kinds of philosophers who are drawn to it. Learning about philosophical archetypes may also give you a better sense of your own present philosophy of life, or at least some aspects of it. Are philosophers always men? The history of Western philosophy contains mostly male representatives, most of them of European ancestry. This has led to the sarcastic but important charge that Western philosophy is nothing but the study of dead white males. Even though increasing numbers of women are entering the ranks of professional philosophy today, men still outnumber women among professional philosophers. Although throughout history individual women were recognized for their insight and brilliance, most of them remained, or were kept, outside of the formal history of philosophy. In our own times, the recognition of women philosophers is improving. Suzanne Langer, L. Susan Stebbing, Simone de Beauvoir, Simone Weil, Ayn Rand, Christina Hoff Sommers, Alison Jagger, Susan Mahler-Oken, and Martha Nussbaum, among many others, have achieved renown as philosophers. Women philosophers are still generally not as well known, however, as women in fields such as psychology. The fact that women are still underrepresented in many fields underscores the serious consequences that pervasive cultural prejudices have on the search for truth, because, until recently, Western philosophy has been dominated by an emphasis on logical reasoning and written argument. Other expressions of philosophical insight have been given less attention. Until the 18th century, most Western philosophers represented a small class of highly educated men, able to support themselves independently or associated with the church or some other source of income. Only with the emergence of great public universities were higher education and philosophy open to people from other backgrounds. And even then, philosophers tended to remain members of an educated male elite. In the following passage, Mary Ellen Waite, the head of a team of scholars that has compiled a valuable series called A History of Women Philosophers, notes firsthand the difficulty of filling in some of the gaps in the history of philosophy, on a sweltering October afternoon in 1980. I sought comfort in the basement library of City University of New York's Graduate Center. I came upon a reference to a work by Aegidius Menegius, on the history of women philosophers, published in 1690 and 1692. I had never heard of any women philosophers prior to the 20th century with the exceptions of Queen Christina of Sweden, known as Descartes' student, and Hildegard von Bingen, who lived in the 12th century. It took 16 months to obtain a copy of Menegius' book. As it turns out, many of the women he listed as philosophers were astronomers, astrologers, gynecologists, or simply relatives of male philosophers. Nevertheless, the list of women alleged to have been philosophers was impressive. By the end of 1981 I had concluded that the accomplishments of some 100 or more women philosophers had been omitted from the standard philosophic reference works and histories of philosophy. Just check sources such as the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Copleston, Zeller, Berry, Grote and others. If the women are mentioned at all, it is in passing, in a footnote. Point 1. There is no escaping the fact that Western philosophy has been predominantly male-influenced throughout its history, shaped by a strong preference for rational and objective evidence rather than by more holistic and intuitive approaches to problems. The pervasiveness of this orientation makes it imperative that we acknowledge this problem. Chapters 9, 11, and 13 to 17 include some intriguing critiques of rationalism and universalism. For deeper consideration, to what extent do you think gender and ethnic background should be considered in evaluating an individual's philosophical beliefs? Do gender, ethnic background, and other personal factors, age, income, and so on, control what we think? Is your response to this question dependent on such factors? How would, or could, you find out without being unduly influenced by the very factors under scrutiny? Philosophy and the search for truth. Even with its cultural limits and biases, philosophy is perhaps the most open of all subjects. Its primary goals are clarity of expression and thought, and its chief components are reason, insight, contemplation, and experience. No question or point of view is off limits. The best philosophers, no matter what their personal beliefs, defer to the most compelling arguments regardless of their origins. Such important philosophers as Plato, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, John Stuart Mill, Soren Kierkegaard, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Martin Heidegger, to name but a few, radically questioned and revised their own thinking over the course of their lives, reacting to what they saw as more compelling evidence. Today, the philosophical arguments raised by women and other philosophical outsiders have expanded the ever-growing philosophical community. The history of philosophy is, in the words of Walter Kaufmann, the history of heresy. There has always been a powerful philosophical tradition that challenges the status quo and confronts social institutions. In recent times, this tradition has found effective and powerful expression among philosophers concerned with the environment, animal rights, family structure, racism, and sexism. Because archetypal figures exert such far-reaching influence, it is hard to predict who they will be with any certainty. That's understandable. We cannot merely assign archetypal status to a person, no matter how tempting that seems. In this regard, philosophy is no different from other fields. History teaches us that most of any given era's significant and popular figures don't usually retain their significance much beyond their own lifetimes. So predicting the emergence of archetypal philosophers must be approached with caution. In chapters 17 and 18, we will look at some important 20th century philosophers and reflect on the persistence of philosophical questions. The history of philosophy is a living thing. It is still being written. Perhaps you will contribute to it. Eventually, all facets of wisdom may be equally welcome, and future textbooks will not have sections like this one. And as you will quickly see, the ultimate issue is not who said something or who said it first, but whether it is true and worthwhile. Wisdom, it seems, transcends color, gender, social class, and ethnicity. Isn't all this just a matter of opinion? Does it ever occur to you that there's no way to settle the kinds of philosophical issues we have been discussing because they are only about beliefs and opinions? Perhaps you believe that what's right for someone else might not be right for me. It's best to just let others believe whatever they want, and I'll believe whatever I want. This kind of thinking is a form of mellow relativism. Relativism is the belief that knowledge is determined by specific qualities of the observer. In other words, absolute, universal knowledge of the truth is impossible. One opinion is as good as another. People who see themselves as sophisticated sometimes adopt a relativistic attitude towards such philosophical questions as what is the meaning of life? Or is democracy the best form of government? They reason that there are nearly as many answers to such questions as there are lifestyles, religions, cultures, and individuals. Then, too, relativists can also point to the seemingly endless differences of op and ion about abortion, the right to die, capital punishment, the existence and nature of God, affirmative action, immigration policies, the president's moral character, or the greatest rock and roll singer or basketball player in history. We haven't even gotten to evolution versus intelligent design, alien autopsies, whether men are from Mars and women are from Venus, whether one ethnicity or gender is superior to another, or whether homosexuals are fit to raise children. With all this diversity of opinion, the relativist wonders how we can ever agree on who is really wise. Amateur relativists can be heard saying things like, well, there's no way to decide if this particular affirmative action policy is better than that one. African Americans, women, and members of other protected classes favor it because they'll get first crack at all the good jobs, government grants, and scholarships. Middle-aged white males don't like it because now it's their turn to ride in the back of the social bus. It's always a matter of perspective. Relativists say things like, Professor, I think my essay grade is unfair. It's only your opinion. I mean, this is not like science or math. Here in philosophy class, there's no real way to determine which opinion about Plato's theory of justice is true. Just because you've got a PhD doesn't mean you're right. You're still just giving your opinion. Somewhat more sophisticated versions of this sort of relativistic reasoning are made by some social scientists, who argue that there is no way for one culture to judge another. In America, for instance, most of us think it's wrong to treat women L and do be as second-class citizens who should defer to their fathers, brothers, and husbands. But in some Middle Eastern countries, the notion that women should have social equality is viewed as absolutely wrong. Who are we, the relativist asks, to judge a completely different way of life? In the following passage, the sociologist James Q. Wilson describes his experiences with relativism in the classroom. In my classes, college students asked to judge a distant people, practice, or event will warn one another and me not to be judgmental, or to impose your values on other people. These remarks are most often heard when they are discussing individual lifestyles, the modern, non-judgmental word for what used to be called character. If asked to defend their admonitions against being judgmental, the students sometimes respond by arguing that moral judgments are arbitrary, but more often they stress the importance of tolerance and fair play, which, in turn, require understanding and even compassion. Do not condemn some practice, say, drug use or unconventional sexuality, that ought to be a matter of personal choice. Do not criticize some group, say, ghetto rioters, whom you do not know and whose beliefs and experiences you do not understand. These students are decent people. In most respects, their lives are exemplary. Thus it was all the more shocking when, during a class in which we were discussing people who at great risk to themselves had helped European Jews during the Holocaust, I found that there was no general agreement that those guilty of the Holocaust itself were guilty of a moral horror. It all depends on your perspective, one said. I'd first have to see those events through the eyes of people affected by them, another remarked. No doubt some perpetrators were caught up in that barbaric episode for reasons that we might understand and even excuse. What worried me was not that the students were prepared to accept some excuses, but that they began their moral reasoning on the subject by searching for excuses. They seemed assume that one approaches a moral question by taking a relativist position and asking, how, given the interests and values of another person, might we explain what happened? Dot. 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 2. Dot. Dot. Many of my students. Dot. Dot. What counts as a decent human being is relative to historical circumstance, a matter of transient consensus about what attitudes are normal and what practices are unjust. 2. Wilson claims that such radical relativism is rampant among college students and many professors today. That's difficult to say. Regardless of how common relativism is, the issue of relativism remains controversial. Sometimes relativism is advocated as a form of tolerance, as in the example Wilson cites. Conflicts between relativists and non-relativists are found throughout the history of philosophy. Indeed, the first major Western philosopher, Socrates, emerged as a public figure partly because of his struggles with early relativists, known as sophists. The struggle between relativists and non-relativists is one of the most exciting in the history of ideas. We'll study it in chapters 3, 4, and 5 and then again toward the end of our survey of philosophy in chapters 11 and 14 to 17. By the way, just about every relativist I have met argues for his relativism or at least tries to give reasons why my non-relativism is inferior, misguided, mistaken, or intolerant. As if that weren't odd enough, the relativist often gets angry when I simply point out that, according to his own relativistic claims, it is impossible for his views to be righter than mine. After all, relativism is just his opinion. Whether or not we're relativists, let's do our best to give philosophers a chance to make their cases before we accept or reject them. Wisdom, knowledge, and belief. The chief goal of wisdom is a fundamental understanding of reality as it relates to living a good life. At its core, wisdom is reasonable and practical, focusing on the true circumstances and character of each individual. We might say then, that wisdom is good judgment about complex situations. Consequently, wisdom involves reflection, insight, a capacity to learn from experience, and some plausible conception of the human condition. Unlike forms of knowledge that require formal education and specialized intelligence, wisdom has been associated with experience in a way that theoretical and intellectual knowledge has not. That may be why wisdom is so often associated with the elders of a tribe or clan. Yet, clearly, age alone cannot guarantee wisdom, nor can intelligence. Wisdom has also been associated with personal virtue far more than knowledge has. Philosophers generally agree that knowledge is some form of true belief. Questions then arise as to how to distinguish true belief from mistaken belief, and, as you might expect, different philosophers give different answers involving the roles of reason, perception, experience, intuition, and social agreement in this process. Some philosophers go so far as to deny the possibility of knowledge entirely. See chapters 3, 5, 9, 10, 14 to 17. Philosophers also distinguish between theoretical and practical knowledge. Theoretical knowledge involves the accurate compilation and assessment of factual Systematic information and relationships. Practical knowledge consists of skills needed to do things like play the piano, use a bandsaw, remove a tumor, or bake a cake. Depending on their nature, evaluating knowledge claims involves logical argumentation, scientific experiments and predictions, or the demonstration of some skillful performance. It would seem, then, that to know X means, first, that X actually is true, second, that I believe X to be true, and third, that I can justify or establish my belief in X by providing adequate evidence. Knowledge claims raise some interesting and thorny questions. For example, is a strong personal feeling adequate evidence? How much proof is enough? According to whose criteria? Philosophers demand that we provide reasons to justify our knowledge claims. In contrast to knowledge, belief refers to the subjective mental acceptance that a claim is true. Beliefs, unlike knowledge, need not be true. Because beliefs are subjective mental states, it is possible to be firmly convinced that a belief is correct when it is not. On the other hand, sometimes our beliefs are true, but we're unable to offer adequate evidence for them. Although beliefs can be either true or false, technically speaking, false knowledge is impossible. The very idea is self-contradictory. For the most part, our everyday language reflects an understanding of this important distinction. We rarely say, I had false knowledge that peach pits boost intelligence. Instead, we say something like, I had pretty good reasons to think that peach pits boost intelligence, but I've since learned that I was mistaken. Or we say, I used to believe that peach pits boost intelligence, but now I know better. In other words, sometimes what we thought we knew turns out to be mistaken. Some beliefs are more reasonable than others, and there's a big difference between informed belief and mere belief. Mere belief refers to a conviction that something is true for which the only evidence is the conviction itself. If that sounds circular, it's because it is. Mere belief validates itself, or tries to. Most philosophers and scientists believe that truth cannot be reduced to merely believing something. For example, you do not have cancer just because you believe that you do. The best way to distinguish reliable beliefs from problematic ones is to subject important ideas to careful scrutiny. To a certain extent, we can, and must, do this for ourselves. Ignorance is not an option because we are all limited by our experiences, abilities, and preferences. We cannot just rely on our own untested thinking. We need to consider others' ideas, and we need to subject our beliefs to the scrutiny of others. In the realm of philosophy, we would be wise to take advantage of those thinkers and ideas that have stood the test of time and significance. Of course, we do not want to accept the arguments of philosophers just because they are considered great or important, even though we need to think for ourselves, impulsively or defensively rejecting important philosophical arguments before we have really thought about them is foolish and arrogant. It is foolish because we cannot really know what value there is in a position if we do not give it fair hearing. It is arrogant because some merely rejecting, or mocking, ideas that have influenced careful thinkers from the past and present implies that without any background knowledge we know more than philosophers, scientists, and theologians who have devoted years of study to these issues. More subtly, we can shut off challenging questions by prejudging them, by being inattentive and bored when they come up, or by mocking other points of view without investigating them. When we do this, we put ourselves in the position of holding on to a belief regardless of the facts. In such a state, we become indifferent to the possibility of error or enlightenment. Willed ignorance is the name of this closed-minded attitude, and it is as opposite from the love of wisdom as any attitude I can think of. For most of us, ignorance is not a serious option. As thoughtful people, our choices are not between philosophical indifference and philosophical inquiry but between a life lived consciously and fully or a life that just happens. Because of its fragility and finiteness, life is just too important not to philosophize about, and we know it. Summary of main points. The word philosophy comes from Greek roots meaning, the love of wisdom. Philosophy in the archetypal sense is an activity as well as a fixed body of knowledge. A philosopher is a lover of wisdom, someone who has a compelling need to pursue wisdom. Areas of philosophy include metaphysics, epistemology, axiology, ethics, aesthetics, political philosophy, social philosophy, and logic. Philosophical archetypes are philosophers who express an original or influential point of view in a way that significantly affects subsequent philosophers and non-philosophers. The history of Western philosophy has been dominated by males of European ancestry, but increasing numbers of women philosophers are expanding the scope and nature of philosophy. The chief goal of wisdom is a fundamental understanding of reality as it relates to living a good life. Wisdom is reasonable and practical, focusing on the true circumstances and character of each individual. Wisdom is good judgment about complex situations that involves reflection, insight, and some plausible conception of the human condition. Philosophers generally agree that knowledge is some form of true belief. This raises questions about distinguishing true belief from mistaken belief, and different philosophers give different weights to the roles reason, perception, experience, intuition, and social agreement play in this process. Some philosophers deny the possibility of knowledge entirely. Philosophers distinguish between theoretical and practical knowledge. Theoretical knowledge involves the accurate compilation and assessment of factual and systematic relationships. Practical knowledge consists of skills needed to do things like play the piano, use a bandsaw, remove a tumor, or bake a cake. Relativism is the belief that knowledge is determined by specific qualities of the observer. In other words, absolute, universal knowledge of the truth is impossible. One opinion is as good as another. Willed ignorance is indifference to the possibility of one's error or one's enlightenment. People with this attitude hold on to beliefs regardless of the facts. Post-reading reflections. Now that you've had a chance to learn about philosophy, use your new knowledge to answer these questions. 1. Is our culture suffering from a kind of philosophical illiteracy? Cite specific examples and identify patterns to support your answer. 2. If you could make only one improvement in the American educational system, what would it be? Why? 3. Are there better reasons for studying philosophy than just meeting some academic requirement? If yes, what are they? If no, why not? Don't be hesitant to give your honest opinion. 4. What is the difference between knowledge and belief? How are they related? 5. Popular and historical conceptions of wise men and women usually present them as elders. Do you think this is accurate? Is the notion of a wise young person somehow flawed? Explain, citing examples. 6. How would you explain what philosophy is to someone who did not already know? Surely, life is not merely a job. Why do we go through the struggle to be educated? Is it merely in order to pass some examinations and get a job? Or is it the function of education to prepare us while we are young to understand the whole process of life? Having a job and earning one's livelihood is necessary, but is that all? Are we being educated only for that? Surely, life is not merely a job, an occupation. Life is wide and profound. It is a great mystery, a vast realm in which we function as human beings. If we merely prepare ourselves to earn a livelihood, we shall miss the whole point of life, and to understand life is much more important than merely to prepare for examinations and become very proficient in mathematics, physics, or what you will. It is a shameful question. The idea that devoting time to philosophy distracts us from practical concerns is an old one. And, of course, the very suggestion that philosophy is not as useful or practical as other subjects or activities is itself a philosophical idea that requires justification. In the following passage, the prolific philosophical historian Will Durant challenges the notion that being useful is supremely important. The busy reader will ask, is all this philosophy useful? It is a shameful question. We do not ask it of poetry, which is also an imaginative construction of a world incompletely known. If poetry reveals to us the beauty our untaught eyes have missed, and philosophy gives us the wisdom to understand and forgive, it is enough, and more than the world's wealth. Philosophy will not fatten our purses, nor lift us to dizzy dignities in a democratic state. It may even make us a little careless of these things. For what if we should fatten our purses, or rise to high office, and yet all the while remain ignorantly naive, coarsely unfurnished in the mind, brutal in behavior, unstable in character, chaotic in desire, and blindly miserable? ... Perhaps philosophy will give us, if we are faithful to it, a healing unity of soul. We are so slovenly and self-contradictory in our thinking, it may be that we shall clarify ourselves, and pull ourselves together into consistency, and be ashamed to harbor contradictory desires or beliefs. And through unity of mind may come that unity of purpose and character which makes a personality, and lends some order and dignity to our existence. The Prejudices of Practical Men. If we are not to fail in our endeavor to determine the value of philosophy, we must first free our minds from the prejudices of what are wrongly called practical men. The practical man, as this word is often used, is one who recognizes only material needs, who realizes that men must have food for the body, but is oblivious of the necessity of providing food for the mind. If all men were well off, if poverty and disease had been reduced to their lowest possible point, there would still remain much to be done to produce a valuable society, and even in the existing world the goods of the mind are at least as important as the goods of the body. It is exclusively among the goods of the mind that the value of philosophy is to be found, and only those who are not indifferent to these goods can be persuaded that the study of philosophy is not a waste of time. Dot. 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 Philosophy is to be studied, not for the sake of any definite answers to its questions, since no definite answers can, as a rule, be known to be true, but rather for the sake of the questions themselves, because these questions enlarge our conception of what is possible, enrich our intellectual imagination and diminish the dogmatic assurance which closes the mind against speculation, but above all because through the greatness of the universe which philosophy contemplates, mind also is rendered great, and becomes capable of that union with the universe which constitutes its highest good. Relativism. The belief that knowledge is determined by specific qualities of the observer, including age, ethnicity, gender, and cultural conditioning. Wisdom. A fundamental understanding of reality as it relates to living a good life, reasonable and practical, focusing on the true circumstances and character of each individual, good judgment about complex situations involving reflection, insight, and a plausible conception of the human condition. Knowledge. True belief. Knowledge. Theoretical, the accurate compilation and assessment of factual and systematic relationships. Knowledge. Practical. The skills needed to do things like play the piano, use a band saw, remove a tumor, or bake a cake. Belief. Conviction or trust that a claim is true, an individual's subjective mental state distinct from knowledge. Belief. Mere. A conviction that something is true for which the only evidence is the sincerity of the believer. Willed ignorance. An attitude of indifference to the possibility of error or enlightenment that holds on to beliefs regardless of the facts. Archetype. A basic image that represents our conception of the essence of a certain type of person, according to psychologist C.G. Jung. Some of the images have been shared by the whole human race from the earliest times. Archetype. Philosophical. A philosopher who represents an original or influential point of view in a way that significantly affects philosophers and non-philosophers, cynic, saint, pessimist, optimist, atheist, rationalist, idealist, and so on. Quotes. Beggars get handouts before philosophers because people have some idea of what it's like to be blind and lame. Diogenes. Of what use is a philosopher who doesn't hurt anybody's feelings? Diogenes. I do not know how to teach philosophy without becoming a disturber of the peace. Baruch Spinoza. Overview of classical themes. Empty is the philosopher's argument by which no human suffering is therapeutically treated. For just as there is no use in a medical art that does not cast out the sicknesses of the bodies, so too there is no use in philosophy, unless it casts out the suffering of the soul. Epicurus. There is, I assure you, a medical art for the soul. It is philosophy, whose aid need not be sought, as in bodily diseases, from outside ourselves. We must endeavor with all our strength to become capable of doctoring ourselves. Cicero. All humanity is sick. I come therefore to you as a physician who has diagnosed this universal disease and is prepared to cure it. Buddha. The unexamined life is not worth living. Socrates. Copyright is to C.K.C.O.M.S.E.A.N. Joe LLY. Learning objectives describe the role of mythology in ancient Greek culture. Copyright is to C.K.C.O.M.S.E.A.N. Joe LLY. Learning objectives describe the role of mythology in ancient Greek culture. Describe what the transition from the mythological worldview to a more philosophic worldview resulted in. Identify the two crucial principles inherent in mythological accounts of life that are still disputed and discussed by contemporary philosophers. Give an example of the fallacy of anachronism. Give an example of the ad hominem fallacy. Critique the rationale behind the principle of empathetic understanding, paying special attention to the context in which it is first introduced. Western philosophy began in ancient Greece about 800 years before the time of Christ. At that time, the chief component of Greek culture was a powerful religious mythology. These early myths offered primitive explanations of natural phenomena, human history, and the gods. They provided standards of conduct, morality, social obligations, education, art, religious practices, and so on. The most important mythical view of life was expressed in the Iliad and the Odyssey, two epic poems attributed to the ancient Greek poet Homer, c. 8th century B.C.E. For the Greeks of Homer's era, everything happened through some kind of divine agency. They believed, for example, that the sun was carried around the heavens by Apollo's golden chariot, that thunder and lightning were hurled down from the top of Mount Olympus by Zeus, and that the motion of Poseidon's trident created waves. Other natural phenomena were thought to have similar divine origins. The nature of the community, victory or defeat in war, the course of love, and other human affairs were also directly tied to the gods. The ancient Greek gods were exaggerated human beings, bigger, stronger, and faster. Like human beings, they were also jealous, sneaky, biased, lazy, promiscuous, and violent. They were not, however, morally or spiritually superior to humans. In fact, the gods were often indifferent to human affairs, including human suffering, because they were involved in complicated soap operas of their own. Occasionally, the gods took an interest in an individual human being or involved themselves in wars or politics, often treating people as pieces in an elab or 8 chess-like game. Copyright is to C.K. Siom, DNCAN 1890. Although the ancient Greeks' mythological accounting of events ultimately failed, it implied two crucial principles that are still disputed by philosophers. 1. There is a difference between the way things appear and the way they really are. 2. There are unseen causes of events. These principles marked a major advance beyond less analytic mythological characterizations of nature and society. Greek mythology was not sheer fantasy, it was the product of a desire to find explanations. Science grew out of this search for explanations, and philosophy grew out of attempts to provide rational justification for these early pre-scientific explanations. As ancient Greece developed, its social structure became less restrictive, though by no means democratic in the modern sense. Colonization of outlying cities and communities contributed to the rise of philosophy, as increased social and political freedom combined with an established culture to permit increasingly free inquiry and exchange of ideas. As Greek civilization grew, colonization led to increasing interaction with sophisticated nearby Eastern cultures, and the mythological worldview became less effective. Explaining events with the gods' will that became less and less satisfying. Pre-Socratic Western philosophers challenged the mythological worldview by asking for rational explanations of questions that mythology could not adequately answer. What causes earthquakes? Where do islands come from? Why doesn't the earth fall out of the sky like an apple from a tree? What holds it up? And what holds that up? Why don't the stars fall out of the sky? Or, more subtly yet, how come if I eat fish and grain, I don't look like a fish or stalk of wheat? How does fish stuff become fingernail stuff? Where does the stone go that is worn away by the waterfall? I cannot see it being chipped away. What is this invisible stuff that goes away? And, again, where did stuff come from? Where does it go? See Chapter 2 for a fuller account of this stage of philosophical development. Nature and convention. In their efforts to provide unified rational explanations, these early philosophers first concentrated on the world order, cosmos in Greek, and nature, physis or physis in Greek. You may recognize the roots of the English words cosmos and physics in these ancient Greek terms. Around the 5th century, an element of specialization emerged throughout the ancient world. Actually, the word division is probably more accurate than specialization, because philosophers began to distinguish between nature, physis, and convention, nomos, rather than to specialize along narrower lines. The terms norm, normative, and normal derive from the Greek root nomos. In the West, humanistic philosophers known as sophists, Chapter 3, turned away from the study of nature and toward the study of man. In China and Southeast Asia, humanistic sages, Chapter 1, turned away from the study of gods and spirits and toward the study of man and nature. Contemporary lessons from the past. You're right to wonder about the use of the word man here. The ancient world was socially hierarchical and chauvinistic in its divisions of people into social classes of varying status, influence, and power according to nationality, bloodlines, a crude form of racial thinking, gender, language and dialect, talent, and beauty. For many, but not all, classical philosophers, women were, by nature, not capable of philosophical reasoning. Of course, in this, the philosophers were not alone, they reflected the norms of their times, as did many women. The Asian sage Confucius, Chapter 1, for example, compared women to servants who were easily offended. Plato, arguably the single most influential Western philosopher, thought of women as lesser men, although he also allows women in the ranks of the philosopher kings who occupy the highest strata in his ideal state. Chapter 5. Aristotle, Chapter 6, one of the most significant thinkers in the history of Western philosophy, thought of women as mistakes of nature, incomplete, or misbegotten men. The hedonist Epicurus, on the other hand, made no philosophical distinctions between men and women. Chapter 7. Some of the most important and complex questions philosophers ask today concern proper attitudes toward thinkers from the past. Chapters 9, 11, 17, and Lee GHTPX 18 address this issue directly, and reference to it recurs throughout our philosophical journey. But at the beginning of this inquiry, let me encourage you to seek empathetic understanding before passing judgment on new ideas and those who advocate them. Practicing this principle helps avoid confusing issues and arguments with the persons who advocate them. When we uncritically and rigidly apply contemporary values to past practices and ideas, we commit the fallacy of anachronism. Even though we can never be sure that our current understanding of the past is accurate, we can make good faith efforts to understand the conditions that affected people's thinking and acting. Doing so does not commit us to some form of relativism or prevent us from evaluating ideas from other times and cultures. Rather, understanding the historical context that gives rise to a philosophical point of view allows us to cull from the richness and complexity of the entire human condition. Further, we do not need to reject an entire philosophical enterprise just because we find some aspect of it unacceptable, unless what's unacceptable is the heart of the enterprise or is entailed by essential components of it. Just as we do not want to uncritically impose contemporary values on ancient philosophers, neither do we want to reject a philosopher's arguments because we object to that philosopher's personal habits or beliefs. When we do that, we commit what is known as the ad hominem fallacy. Ad hominem is Latin for at the man. In this context, it means against the arguer, against the person making the argument. Ironically, the term ad hominem presents us with an example of the pervasiveness and ambiguity of terms based on the root man, mankind, human, chairman, humanistic, and even woman. The search for excellence. One of the major themes in ancient philosophy is the search for general human excellence, or virtue. The Greek word for virtue, erit, means excellence, and is associated with potency and functionality. The Chinese word for virtue, zhen, connotes benevolence, human ity, and being a real, authentic person. Thus, something lacking in virtue fails to function in some way. Without virtue, things are dysfunctional, incomplete, not themselves, not what they are meant to be. In the West, the philosophical search for human excellence links the Sophists Chapter 3 to Socrates Chapter 4, Plato Chapter 5, Aristotle Chapter 6, and the Stoics Chapter 7. In Asia, the ancient sages also produced long-standing theories of virtue and well-being. Chapter 1. The search for happiness. As a rule, ancient philosophers did not distinguish between being good and being happy the way many of us do today. Rather, they thought of living the good life as living well, in the sense of thriving, of being healthy or fully human. Today, it is common to equate being happy with almost any form of personal satisfaction. If happiness is a feeling, then I cannot be wrong about being happy. If I feel happy, I am happy. This particular view of happiness defines being happy, in purely subjective and individualistic terms. Classical notions of happiness were more complicated. A helpful analogy here is between being healthy and being happy and feeling happy. It's easy to understand that Margaret may not be well even though Margaret feels well. In other words, Margaret can be unhealthy and feel fine. Conversely, Joe can be convinced that he is dying from cancer even though he is cancer-free. Further, unhealthy individuals can, because they are unhealthy, get used to being sick. Thus the habitual smoker feels good when she poisons herself with a puff on a cigarette but feels bad when she acts wisely and refrains from smoking. If, however, more than subjective conditions are necessary for happiness, then the individual is not the determiner of happiness. In such a view, it is possible to think you are happy and be wrong. If that sounds crazy to you, you are not alone. But before dismissing classical notions of happiness, wait and see what sorts of reasons the ancient philosophers give for their views. Chapter 1. The Asian sages Lao Tzu, Confucius, and Buddha, who knows why heaven dislikes what it dislikes. Even the sage considers it a difficult question. Even the sage considers it a difficult question. Lao Tzu, he who learns but does not think is lost, he who thinks but does not learn is in danger. Confucius, if you will now and at all times, whether walking, standing, sitting, or lying, only concentrate on eliminating analytic thinking, at long last you will inevitably discover the truth. Buddha, learning objectives. After you complete this chapter, you should be able to differentiate between an archetype and a sage. Characterize Tao. Relate yin and yang. Utilize the golden mean to distinguish between the inferior man and the superior man according to Confucius. Describe humanism. Define the term Li. Define the term Gen. Explain asceticism. List the Four Noble Truths. Describe a bodhisattva. Explain the problem posed by talking about nirvana. Our survey of philosophical archetypes begins with a look at three of the most influential philosophical archetypes of all time, the sages Lao Tzu, Confucius, and Buddha. A therapeutic figure who combines religious inspiration with extraordinary insight into the human condition, the sage is the oldest of the philosophical archetypes. The English word sage is derived from the Latin sapiens, meaning wise. The term sage has been used to refer to masters associated with religious traditions and to the wise elders of a group or tribe. Philosophers who address how we live and whose lives reflect noteworthy integrity, compassion, and courage are also referred to as sages. As a rule, the ancient sages focused on identifying the root causes of happiness and unhappiness. Today, the title sage is associated with individuals who manifest a deep, lifelong commitment to learning and teaching that extends beyond an academic or merely theoretical interest in living wisely. The harmony of heaven and earth in ancient Asian cosmologies, all events were said to be interconnected. In ancient Chinese cosmology, everything was influenced by the harmonious working together of heaven and earth following the Tao of all existence. Literally, way, or path, Tao, or Tao, cannot be precisely defined or named. Among contemporary scholars, there is a dispute about whether to refer to the way as Tao or Tao in English. So don't be surprised to come across both, or to discover alternate renderings of the names of the sages Lao Tzu and Chuang Tzu as Laozi and Zhuangzi or Laozi and Zhuangzi. The older system of rendering these terms is known as Wade Giles and the contemporary as Pinyin. For the most part, I use Wade Giles because there are so many beautiful, inexpensive, and handy editions available that use it. Whether we refer to it as Tao or Tao, the way is usually translated as the source of all existence, the principle of all things, the way or path of the universe, or the moral law. Tao unfolds and influences all of nature while remaining hidden from empirical, sensory experience. In this cosmology, heaven and earth constitute a single reality, a sort of heaven-earth, rather than two diametrically opposed and separate realities. Nature consists of the continual interaction of two opposing, but not separable, forces known as yin, earth, passive element, and yang, heaven, active element. Yin is weak, negative, dark, and destructive. Yang is strong, positive, light, and constructive. Heaven, yang, and earth, yin, exist in a perpetually harmonious balance, actually a perpetual balancing, according to Tao. Yin and yang go so far back in Chinese history that we cannot be sure of their original meanings. The classic Confucian text, The Doctrine of the Mean, says, equilibrium is the great foundation of the world, and harmony its universal path, won by the 5th century B.C.E. Yin and yang were thought of as inextricably linked together. Each was viewed as an expression of the other, operating together in a never-ending cycle of coming together and falling apart, birth and death, wet and dry, day and night, good and evil, male and female, full and empty. This ceaseless interplay of opposing forces is the natural order of things. Part and whole cannot be understood, much less exist, without each other. How could they? The very essence of being a part requires a whole to be a part of, and there can be no whole without parts. Thus, there are no firm, permanent and fixed divisions between the spiritual and the physical or between the natural and the supernatural, nor is there a distinct division between the divine and the human, between reason and intuition. Point 2 Therefore, Tao, the way of heaven-earth, cannot be understood analytically or considered piecemeal, individually. But if life consists of some fundamental, never-ending, and harmonious exchange, why do we so often experience it as a series of apparently discrete, independent events and either, or options? We experience life, or more properly the illusion of life, as discrete events because we are unenlightened and confused. Unaware that the flow of Tao cannot be trapped, we identify with particularities, we prefer the familiar to the exclusion of all else, we cling to things for fear of losing them, we confuse words, labels, with perception, experience. It falls to the sage to identify and preserve Tao by refining the way we talk about it. Point 3. So elusive is this goal that even the sages, with all their wisdom, remain susceptible to the partial view. They disagree over whether human beings are naturally good or naturally evil, over whether Tao is best realized actively through social customs and training, Confucius, or through setting aside all personal striving while spreading compassion to others, Buddha. Lao Tzu recommends passively going with the flow of Tao by abandoning social cultivation and following our natural instincts. Yet for all their apparent differences, the sages insist, if that's the word for it, that suffering, division, and strife need not be our permanent condition, for we share a common human nature from which we can learn. Religion, philosophy, culture, and politics are themselves manifestations of Tao. They interact as complementary parts of a single reality perpetually seeking balance. Sagehood. The sages focus on achieving harmony and virtue here and now as a response to the social conditions in which they lived. For Lao Tzu and Confucius, this was a time of such widespread political and social turmoil that it came to be known as the period of the Warring States. Although traditional Chinese history holds that the period of the Warring States began in 453 BC and lasted for nearly 550 years, some historians push the beginning as far back as 771 BC. The period of the Warring States was marked by fierce struggles for power waged by a succession of warring princes. The resulting civil wars became increasingly violent as armies ignored the customs and traditional rules of conduct known as Li that had previously prevented wholesale pillage and destruction. Each atrocity was answered with an equal or greater atrocity. In one notorious incident, soldiers from one army were not paid until they showed the paymaster the severed heads of their enemies. A.C. Graham, a leading authority on Chinese thought and grammar, describes the teachings of the ancient sages as responses to the breakdown of the rule of heaven, and the moral and political chaos that resulted. Instead of asking, what is the truth? As early Western philosophers did, the Asian sages asked, where is Wei, Tao? Where, they wondered, is the way back to social order and proper conduct? For as a result of their practical concerns, the teachings of the sages are marked by what the philosopher Michael Brannigan characterizes as an intimate rapport between philosophy and its actualization in society. 5. A fully human sensitivity links the three sages we'll look at in this chapter, each of whom speaks from intimate knowledge of suffering and disappointment. Offering anyone who will listen the fruits of their hard-earned research, sages perform a complex social function, part physician of the soul, part prophet, part preacher, part philosopher, part fellow seeker. In subsequent chapters, we'll look at the Western sages Socrates, Chapter 4, Epicurus, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius, all Chapter 7. Unsurprisingly, the sage has no exact equivalent today, at least not in this culture, a culture that encourages individuation and competition, seemingly perpetual social war, precisely what the sages sought to overcome. In this regard, you might find it interesting to contrast the sage with the more warlike sophist, a might-makes-right seller of methods for getting whatever one wants, whose philosophy seems surprisingly contemporary. Sophists are discussed in Chapter 3. If you are unfamiliar with the teachings of the ancient philosophical sages, don't be fooled into thinking that because they talk about harmony and balance, sages are preachy, anti-life figures who don't have anything practical to offer a high-tech, high-energy, individualistic, competitive society. Perhaps the high-tech, specialized, disharmonious nature of our lives means that just the opposite is true. The lasting appeal and influence of the sages suggests that we're not completely sold on the pure suit of fame, power, riches, and prestige, even though we can't just toss our interest in them aside. In distinct but overlapping ways, these archetypal figures encourage us to achieve sagehood for ourselves. Philosophical query based on what you've read so far, can you think of any contemporary examples of sages? If you can, what specific qualities or teachings impress you as sage-like? If you can't, why do you suppose you can't? The do-nothing sage, Lao Tzu legend says that Lao Tzu, c. 575 B.C.E., was a bureaucrat in ancient China, known only by a nickname variously translated as Old Master, Old Man, Old Boy, or Old Philosopher. He may have compiled his book, the Daodejing, under a pseudonym as a form of self-preservation, since he lived during the instability of the period of the Warring States. The scholar A. C. Graham suggests that living in a state of perpetual fear taught the reclusive Lao Tzu, whoever he really was, to develop a self-preserving habit of evasive speech. 6. In fact, however, we know very little of Lao Tzu. According to legend, when he was 160 years old, Lao Tzu grew so disgusted with the hypocrisy and decay of his time that he decided to resign from his position as a bureaucrat to pursue virtue in a more natural environment. Heading west, Lao Tzu Cn Ga Gelarn and G reached the Han Ku Pass, where the keeper of the pass recognized the old sage and said, "You are about to withdraw yourself from sight. I pray you compose a book for me." Lao Tzu honored the man's request by producing a little, 5,000-word book known today as the Daodejing. 7. Next to the Analects of Confucius, the Daodejing is the most influential book in Chinese history. Nearly 1,000 commentaries on it have been written in China and Japan alone. The Daodejing, or the Classic of the Way and the Power, Virtue, is second only to the Bible in the number of English translations available. Today, interpretations of Taoism are continuously emerging in popular philosophical, spiritual, and psychological literature. What accounts for the power of this slim volume, usually divided into 81 chapters, of a page or less in length? Some scholars claim that the Daodejing is so cloudy and obscure, so romantic and poetic, that the reader is free to make it mean anything. To them, the popularity of the Daodejing derives from its lack of clarity, from its ability to mean all things to all people, and from its brevity. A more intriguing possibility is that the book credited to the secretive, perhaps fearful old philosopher expresses genuine, timeless wisdom. Let's see what Lao Tzu has to say to us in the 21st century. The way rather than presenting a philosophic system, Lao Tzu struggled to express a sense of the ultimate, underlying great principle, rule, or cause of the way all things are. Lao Tzu refers to Tao in poetic, suggestive terms. He appeals to our natural instincts and intuitions. In so doing, he hopes to render as little injustice as possible to the throbbing, rich, ever-flowing stream of the way. Tao is, he implies, too rich, too big and too small, simply too much to be trapped by definition, description, or system. Thus, this Taoist sage often speaks in apparent contradictions, in pairs of opposites. He points out the rest of the story by calling our attention to overlooked, but essential, aspects of the way. In a source book in Chinese philosophy, Wing Tsit Chan points out that Tao does not refer to a system or moral truth but to a way of life. Tao is the one which is natural, eternal, spontaneous, nameless, and indescribable. As a way of life, it denotes simplicity, spontaneity, tranquility, weakness, and most important of all, non-action, wu wei. By the latter is not meant literally, inactivity, but rather taking no action that is contrary to nature, in other words, letting nature take its own course. 8. In the opening stanza of the Daodejing, Lao Tzu signals us that this is not an attempt to articulate Tao according to the limiting rules of rational consistency. Ever-flowing, Tao cannot be captured in systems or in words. Consider the subtle differences among the following two translations of the famous opening lines of Chapter 1 of the Daodejing. 1. The Tao that can be told of is not the absolute Tao, the names that can be given. The Asian sages, Lao Tzu, Confucius, and Buddha 27 are not the absolute names. The nameless is the origin of heaven and earth, the named is the mother of all things. 9. 2. As for the way that can be spoken of is not the constant way, as for names, the name that can be named is not the constant name. The nameless is the beginning of the 10,000 things, the named is the mother of the 10,000 things. 10. Each translation approximates a sense of something, it circles but cannot explicitly define the way. In Lao Tzu's phrase, words cannot trap Tao. The sage must find a way to speak without speaking, and discuss what cannot be discussed. The sage will attempt to communicate the experience of a cosmic or spiritual pattern. This is quite different from expressing a concept, idea, or principle. People cannot stop talking about it. Why doesn't Lao Tzu just come right out and tell us straightforwardly that the way cannot be expressed in words, that it is the source of all things, and that it is only discovered by ridding ourselves of desire? Perhaps because that's not precisely what he means. The trouble with words, Graham says, is not that they do not fit at all but that they always fit imperfectly. 11. Just because the way cannot be reduced to words or principles does not mean that nothing important and useful can be said about it. Poignantly, Lao Tzu says that although we cannot talk about Tao, people cannot cease discussing it. And that includes, of course, Lao Tzu. is to XSB Louis Lao Tzu's solution to the problem of expressing what cannot be trapped in words is to develop a kind of paradoxical way of communicating in which contradictory assertions and demands keep us from fixing on one, trapped, or dead, interpretation. The sage's hope is that this kind of giving with one hand and taking with the other will draw us in the direction which is the way. 12 Western philosophers as diverse as Heraclitus, Chapter 3, Soren Kierkegaard, Chapter 14, William James, Chapter 15, Friedrich Nietzsche, Chapter 16, and Martin Heidegger and Ludwig Wittgenstein, Chapter 17, struggle with the problem of language, and adopt their own indirect strategies for dealing with what cannot be said, usually with more sting than the old boy. In many ways, the history of philosophy is a history of struggling to say what must be said in ways that do justice to human experience. The sages are not alone in confronting the problem of language. Yet the problem of language lingers because, upon reflection, experience always seems to elude us, to defy complete verbalization. No matter what we say about life, living itself is always something more. It seems as if our best attempts to define or explain the way of life always fall short. Yet the attempts themselves, Lao Tzu reminds us, the very failures themselves, are part of life. It is the mark of a sage to know when to stop talking, and when not to. When we consider all the philosophical, religious, and scientific chatter, about life, virtue, and ultimate reality with a capital R, meaning with a capital M, and truth with a capital T, Lao Tzu's puzzling opening lines attain the power of insight. Talk in the form of once and for all, absolute, fixed systems, dogmas, objective truths, and universal theories pales beside living itself. Saying, talk can help, but saying can also hurt. Saying helps when it draws us to the way, when it awakens us to something more, something beyond ordinary understanding. Saying hurts when labels substitute for perception, when abstract ideas and rigid, exclusive notions of good or bad, right or wrong, true or false block feeling and intuition. Ancient sages and prophets took saying, or naming, very seriously. Across cultures, names, incantations, curses, blessings, and classifications have governed our sense of who we are, who the other is, how we should live, feel, think, and even perceive the world or reality. The more names there are, the more things there are. Once a thing has been named right, wrong, true, false, God, man, higher, lower, we tend to cling to its name, to one perspective. We become dead in Lao Tzu's scheme of things because we lose sight of the ever-flowing range of possibilities, perspectives, and conditions that always go beyond the name. Unlike the myriad things, the way is constantly nameless. 13 And yet. From another point of view, it is convenient to think of the way in words, to think of it as a thing with a name. As for the thing, the way as it is vague and dim. Dim, vague. Within it is a model. Vague, dim. Within it is a thing. From the present to the past its name does not depart. 14. The way of reversal Lao Tzu often calls the undivided, the one. Subsequent commentators sometimes refer to it as being or reality. Whatever Lao Tzu means, he does not conceive of the way at all. That is, the way, or the one, is not a concept to grasp cognitively or logically. Lao Tzu is not trying to discover something more real than what appears to the senses, but a constant way behind the changing and conflicting ways of life and government claimed by competing schools as the official, one, true, way. 15 Lao Tzu's non-rational, non-logical approach presents difficulties for more analytically inclined Western philosophers, some of whom refuse to classify Lao Tzu among the philosophers, suggesting that he belongs with prophetic or religious figures. This is not satisfactory, however, for Asian scholars distinguish between religious Taoism, with its various rituals and beliefs, and philosophical Taoism, exemplified by the Daodejing and the Chuang Tzu. Where does that leave us? How can we evaluate a philosophy that does not attempt to be systematic, rational, or even organized in any ordinary sense? Indeed, what are we to make of a philosophy that suggests that what are often thought of as the basic tools of philosophy, systems, theories, logical reasoning, and linguistic precision, are, in fact, impediments to reality and truth? It is hardly surprising that some philosophers reject Taoism as unphilosophical babbling. Nor is it surprising that other philosophers share Taoism's discomfort with objectivity, dogmatism, rationalism, scientism, and technology. See chapters 14 to 17. We must, Lao Tzu suggests, sometimes violate our own carefully crafted rules and systems if we wish to be decent human beings responsive to the ebb and flow of living itself. Living itself is not a problem to be solved, consequently, it cannot be contained in any system. We must do more than understand, more than provide rules, more than explain with tightly reasoned precision. We must respond and resonate to the ultimate something that throbs with life just beyond the edge of understanding. Lao Tzu says, when the people of the world all know beauty is beauty, there arises the recognition of ugliness. When they all know the good is good, there arises the recognition of evil. Therefore, being and non-being produce each other, difficult and easy complete each other, long and short contrast each other, high and low distinguish each other, sound and voice harmonize with each other, front and back follow each other. 16 But how can we turn off our need to classify, arrange, judge, and label things? How can we stop thinking, analyzing, so much and still remain conscious, alert, and intelligent? Lao Tzu suggests that we adopt an astonishing method of getting mind out of the way, as it were. Philosophical query. The tension between beliefs and facts recurs throughout the history of Western philosophy and explodes in our own time in the form of challenges to the very possibilities of objectivity and universality. Can you spot signs of this division in current affairs?